A new offer for the Wayne County jail site, plus a larger look at growth in downtown Detroit. Also coming up, crime and punishment. New ways to reform corrections in Michigan heading through the legislature, potentially changing the price tag and the lives affected. Plus the Betsy DeVos effect on education. And it's not boring, it's the budget. It's news impacting your world, and MiWeek starts right now.
Did you know Roush Enterprises was selected by Google to assemble a test fleet of 100 prototype self-driving cars in 2015. It also produced the new Domino's delivery cars. And speaking of Domino's, Domino's sells well over 2 million pizzas per day around the world, and half of their sales are digital. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.
Hi there and welcome to MiWeek. I'm Christy McDonald. Thanks so much for joining us. We have a lot to get to this week with big budgets and downtown development plans, and we'll have a deeper look at measures in Lansing to change parole and probation. But let's start in Detroit and that new proposal for the Wayne County jail site downtown. Investor Dan Gilbert's Rock Ventures wants the site for a soccer stadium and entertainment development. He's offering to build a new justice complex less than 2 miles north of the jail site for the $300 million the county was going to have to spend anyway to finish the old site. And it's coming at a time where development and density in Detroit is changing rapidly, leading us to the question of what the city will look like 1 year from now. For some perspective, let's bring in Nolan Finley, the editorial page editor of the Detroit News, and Stephen Henderson, the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press. Guys, it's always good to see you. And my, what an interesting development this week. Just days before Wayne County was set to make a decision to move forward, the Rock Ventures folks come forward and say, well, if you're going to spend $300 million on finishing the jail, how about we build a $420 million complex, and then you just kind of give us the land. What do you see in this deal, Nolan, that's good, or what do you see that's a potential pitfall?
Well, yeah, and I think that's what we've all been looking for. Where's the catch? Where's the fine print? It sounds like an awfully good deal for Wayne County. They're locked in at a $300 million expenditure, what they would have had to spend anyway to finish the jail, plus remodel Frank Murphy Hall of Justice. And instead, they spend the same amount of money. They get a new jail, entirely new courthouse. They get a new juvenile detention center thrown in, and they get then that all moved out of prime property on downtown, and that land back on the tax rolls, producing jobs and revenue. It's hard for me to find the downside.
Wayne County Exec Warren Evans says, "Well, we're going to have to take a look at this." And so, what are you seeing any potential pitfalls here, Stephen?
If there is a pitfall, it's in the numbers. It's in making this all add up so that the county is not spending more money than it was going to have to. And frankly, I think the county's in a position where it could say, "Look, if we're going to do this, we should spend less," because the incentive here is all for Dan Gilbert to get that land. I mean, the county has that land. They have a partially built jail sitting there. There's no reason for them not to finish that unless there's a reason to do it. What's the incentive? And I don't think it's unreasonable for the county to take that position. I think even broader, the question of what happens to that site ought to be under a little more public discussion than just, well, we're going to build another stadium, a fourth stadium in a 2-mile radius in downtown. Not that I mind the stadiums. I like the ones that we have. I think.
Are you questioning the viability of what's going into the stadium in terms of professional soccer?
No, I don't have any problem with soccer. But do we need a fourth stadium in downtown Detroit? Is that the maximum use for that site? That's a question that Dan Gilbert shouldn't be able to just answer alone. The public, the government should have some say over what happens in the way that we redevelop downtown. None of that is to say that this is a bad idea or that it's a bad offer. It just needs to be looked at, and the future use of that site needs to be something that we talk about.
Well, the $120 million is basically what he's paying for this site. It's going to be more than a stadium, as I understand it. There's going to be some mixed-use entertainment, lofts, commercial space, what have you, along with it. I mean, the government hasn't done much in terms of overall planning in downtown
Well,
Detroit.
but that's a problem, right?
Well, I don't
yeah,
see
and I
it
think
as
that maybe
one
that
because
leads to the larger conversation of what a downtown is beginning to look like right now.
well, what downtown, there's a real shift underway, and there has been, from downtown mostly populated by government buildings, and now one that has a much wider mix of buildings, and the government use of that land, the government buildings, the courthouses, et cetera, becoming a much smaller player in the downtown
Well, it was
footprint.
mostly empty, is what it was before. I mean, it wasn't mostly government used. It was mostly
What buildings were there were
rotting-
mostly government buildings.
Well, but they were mostly empty,
Right.
not contributing. And he's changed that picture. Dan Gilbert has changed that picture almost single-handedly, and there's no question that I think that's a good thing. Again, though, go to any other downtown. And just decide to build a stadium. To go to Chicago and say, well, I'm going to build a stadium on this site in the middle of the Central Business District, there are a lot of other people who would have a say in whether that makes sense in the spot where it is.
But we live about a year.
It kind of leads
We
to
haven't done that
the
yet.
larger conversation that we've had among two of us, or the three of us, saying, gosh, in the next year or so, what is downtown going to look like? We've seen some significant
Well, I think we're turning a corner here and really entering a new phase, because we're about done when they complete the Free Press building, which was also announced, and some of the other buildings. We're about done with the rehab work, and now you're starting to see this new hotel, the new Shinola Hotel with the building next door. You're starting to see new things actually go in the ground and come up, and that's going to be a really interesting new phase of this downtown redevelopment.
So who needs to lead the conversation, the larger conversation of how we want to make the
I
downtown?
mean, ideally, you'd have the mayor and city council playing a different role here. I don't have any problem with the DDA, of course, being part of that, but that's very, my point is that you go to any other city, you just don't have one person making all of the decisions about this stuff. We have that going on here. It's not a great idea.
But you don't want the government to get in the way, and that's happened here.
It's not about getting in the way. It's about deciding.
We went through a long period where government was in charge of this and didn't do very well. Certainly,
Actually,
there has
government
to
wasn't
be
in charge of it.
certainly
Those were
there has to
privately
be
held buildings.
oversight. Certainly, there needs to be oversight. But I've been through so many master plans for downtown Detroit over the decades that never got done.
Well, there was no
and
private
now
investment.
Now things are getting done because there's private investment.
Right, but they're not
And private vision.
They're not mutually exclusive. You
No,
can
there
have
should-
hold
there
on,
should be
hold on. You
oversight.
can have private investment, and you can have a master plan that private investment fits into. Every other city does it that way. Why should we be
the
different?
plan has to make sense for the people who are investing the money.
It
And I
also has to
think- and I
make
think we
sense,
can all
but
agree
even
on
more
that.
important, it needs to make sense for the city and the people who live here. And that is a tension that is not represented well in this equation.
It's hard to argue with the momentum we've been seeing here and the progress we've been making.
Go to the
Much of it
neighborhoods that aren't
apart,
benefiting and tell them that.
Much it from it. Well, that's always going to be a problem. It's always been a problem. That has nothing to do with the planning of downtown.
Just because
Detroit.
there's momentum shouldn't mean that it should not be checked. All right, let's move now to Lansing and the push for criminal justice reform. It's something that we've talked about. Michigan has the highest incarceration rate in the Midwest. We pay $2 billion a year for it. And just a week ago, the state Senate passed a 21-bill package trying to cut down on the rate of repeat offenders, how to make sure that parole guidelines are followed, and the programs to help offenders once they get out. Just last week, we aired a One Detroit documentary called Pathways to Prison, looking at why our incarceration rate is high in the state of Michigan, the struggles that people have in the system, and some potential changes. So before debating the bills, this gives you a sense of how people are impacted by parole reforms and reentry programs. Take a look.
Aaron Suganuma counsels substance abusers in Ann Arbor. He earned a master's degree in social work, an outstanding scholar who found a career he hadn't planned.
I had this dream of actually being a reporter. I wanted to be a journalist and go to New York City, go to the Columbia School of Journalism. What actually ended up happening was that I wasn't actually going to class.
Aaron enrolled in a local college, working full-time at restaurants, but he got into trouble when he was 22.
I was physically dependent on drugs. Eventually, the money ran out, and I started committing crimes to be able to support my habit. One thing led to another, and I ended up in prison.
He received 51 months to 10 years for armed robbery, with an out date of January 19, 2009. He was a model inmate, But when the out date came, nothing happened.
This piece of paper that I've been looking at for years saying that this is when you're going to get out, all of a sudden that just disappears. It's no longer guaranteed. There's nothing that I can do about it.
Aaron did get out later in 2009. We live in the era of mass incarceration. Michigan has the highest incarceration rate in the Great Lakes region, spending $2 billion a year, $35,000 for each of the 42,000 people behind bars.
You're spending more money on the failures than you are on the successes.
Back then, Dennis Schrantz, high up in Governor Jennifer Granholm's administration, came up with a plan.
We designed reform policy and practices to try to improve prisoner post-release performance. We named it the Michigan Prisoner Reentry Initiative, and it kind of took off.
The idea? Create a system that gives more help to prisoners when they get out. So the Michigan Prisoner Reentry Initiative, MPRI, came to be, funded by the state with some foundation support.
And with that good plan, you're less likely to commit crime, less likely to commit violations, and that's one of the reasons that it had bipartisan support. Who's against crime reduction, right? If you ask folks, do you want them out with a plan or without a plan, they'll say, well, with a plan.
Calvin Evans served 24 years on a murder charge. His family was working poor, his mother a victim of domestic violence.
I wanted to break that cycle, and so I was willing to take the risk of selling drugs when crack cocaine happened in order to do that. And it was worth the risk to me because all I was going to be is all I ever seen.
Calvin was convicted of a murder he didn't commit, but he does admit to other illegal activities. Before his parole hearing, he created his own 5-year business plan for when he'd get out.
So I presented this to the parole board and said, this is what it is that I'm going to do. This is who it is that I am. And so now I can say to individuals who are coming out that this is a tried and proven method.
Now Calvin helps lead a new program called D-Live at Sinai Grace Hospital in Detroit, working with recovering gunshot victims who need advocates to help turn their lives around. His plan for success includes creating successful outcomes for others.
And coming up on 4 years, what actually happened, I never thought that I'd be working for Wayne State University Sinai Grace Hospital. I never thought that.
A key to MPRI's success, community engagement. It was agreed in Lansing, spend the money locally to support prisoner reentry.
They are going to be in your neighborhood. They're going to be either violating the conditions of their supervision and committing new crimes, or they're going to be employed and paying taxes.
MPRI was riding high. Prisons closed. But then the economy tanked. That while the foundation supporting MPRI collapsed. A victim of white-collar criminal Bernie Madoff. When Governor Snyder took over, MPRI got an overhaul. Now it's called Offender Success. Now with the turn in the state's job climate, the Department of Corrections' focus is helping employers.
Michigan's economy is really on the upswing, and there are a lot of companies that are looking to hire, and the biggest thing we hear is that they just can't find enough qualified, skilled workers.
I'm really excited. Today, it's 225 returning citizens training in jobs, and I hope before long it's going to be 1,000.
Recently, Detroit Mayor Michael Duggan joined 2 returning citizens. That is, parolees from the Detroit Reentry Center, part of an asbestos abatement training program paid for with a federal grant.
We have nearly 3,000 individuals a year released from the state prison system who come back to the city of Detroit. And if we don't create opportunities, those folks are likely to get up to the kinds of things that got them in trouble in the first place.
In Detroit, well-paying jobs in construction and rehabilitation await, as incentives favor employers who hire those who live in the city.
If I hadn't took this program, I didn't have many options at all. So that's why I felt, when I seen the sign signed up for this, I was like, I jumped on the opportunity. You know what I mean? It's very important to me as I'm trying to take steps towards becoming a productive member of society.
There's one other big effort to reduce the prison population. State Representative Kurt Heisey has spent a few years on legislation to get more prisoners out sooner. House Bill 4138 would change how the parole board deals with prisoners when it's time for them to leave.
I look at it as parole reform, to make sure that we are recognizing and rewarding individuals incarcerated in prison who are trying to better themselves, who are getting a GED, who are staying clean from drugs and gang violence.
The bill is called presumptive parole, presuming that when a well-behaved prisoner's out date comes, they might really get out. Reformers say the parole board can hold prisoners long past their out dates for what are called substantial and compelling reasons that can seem more arbitrary than definite.
Some board members will use pretty subjective factors like doesn't show enough empathy, lacks insight, very subjective assessments.
4138 would better define the reasons prisoners should be held. An estimated 3,200 more would be released over the 5 years when it's enacted.
In no way forces the board to release people that there's reason to believe are currently dangerous.
Sounds well and good, but still, 4138 has its detractors.
We're crowded. Macomb County, Southeast Michigan, Wayne County, Oakland County, our jails are crowded.
For county sheriffs, it's simple. When more parolees get out, it's inevitable. More of them will join the ranks in county jails.
This is just going to be a burden on the local taxpayers from the local control and put more strain on our sheriff's budgets.
Winter on Detroit's west side. Substance abuse counselor Aaron Suganuma gets together with his group, called Nation Outside, which is trying to give a voice to the formerly incarcerated.
You know, I didn't know what success meant. I didn't see people getting past this point in their life. I didn't know. I needed a model for it.
MPRI helped Aaron return as a productive citizen. But the parole process, as he sees it, needs work.
This unknowing and lack of faith in the system, I don't know how to count on this. How can I plan to be successful in re-entering if I don't even know when I'm going to get out?
You know, such an interesting personal look at the people who are impacted by this. The House bill, they moved a little bit on last year, and now the Senate has picked it up. But they're still a little far apart in some things. But I don't think you can really emphasize enough the needing for reentry programs, and to even start. You were talking, Stephen, about starting inside when people are still incarcerated.
Right. I mean, that's where you have their attention. That's where you have the opportunity to change somebody's life. I mean, this is someone at the lowest point in their life going into the correction system for something that they've done. The whole process should be focused on how do you prevent that person from staying at that low point? How do you get that person to a different space? And that requires a different kind of mentality than we typically have about what the purpose of the correction system is. Too many people think it's about keeping people away from society or punishing them somehow. And really, it needs to be about correcting those things that have gone wrong in that person's life so that when they get out, which 98% of the people who go to prison end up back out. Most people don't get life sentences. They need to be able to put lives together that are productive.
And also making the point too that they need to know that when it says they're going to get out, that they do get out.
Well, that's the best way to protect society. I mean, if part of this goal here, if the other half of the correction system, the justice system, one's punishment and one's protecting society, you're much more likely to protect society by fixing what's wrong with these folks. I am not a big fan of prison as our only option for punishment. I think we need to deal with a lot of people outside of prison and focus on fixing them and stopping the criminal behavior, and then they're no longer a threat to society and they're living a useful life. We lock them away, throw away their lives, and when they come out, we haven't changed.
They don't have a lot of options.
And I really also don't really believe in these firm sentences. You're going to serve 20 years or you're going to serve 10. Send them to prison with the idea that you're going to serve until you're able and willing to come back in society and live a productive life without threatening your neighbors. If that takes 5 years, great. If it takes 20, you know, not so great, but let's not treat every prisoner the same way.
I would also say you've got to back up, and when you're talking about helping people deal with where they are right now, there's a whole pipeline that we talk about to even how people get to that point.
Yeah.
And I would encourage you, head to MiWeek.org. We have a link to that entire Detroit One special, Pathways to Prison. Love for you to watch it. Tell us what you think about it, and it does address a lot of those problems that you have of people starting when they are just in grade school.
Absolutely, you see it in schools. You see the way schools respond to kids, and let's be honest, how they respond to African American kids, how they respond to African American boys who will grow up to populate prisons more so than any other demographic in our population. All of this stuff starts when they are very young and responding to behavior that may or may not be inappropriate, but doing it in a way that is about criminalizing that behavior as opposed to dealing with it.
And then you got the throwaway kids, all these kids that are in the foster system because their parents weren't able to take care of them. Nobody was able to take care of them in their family. And so they hop from place to place to place with no support, no anchor, no really value system in place. And they're fending for themselves. Well, they grow up eventually, and then we hold them responsible for the neglect as a society we've done their whole lives.
I got to say, and in this show that I worked on, and the folks here at PBS worked on as well, we address all of that. So go ahead, check that out at MiWeek.org. Time now for some headlines. Hey, really interesting, Betsy DeVos. So it came down to the vice president. So, Nolan, I'm going to start with you because one of your colleagues, Ingrid Jacques, had the first interview with Betsy DeVos after she was confirmed. What is the state of education under Betsy DeVos now in this country?
Everybody talked about during these hearings, she's going to destroy the public schools. I hope she destroys the education department. That is a $70 billion a year bureaucracy that doesn't move the needle on education. Most of what it does replicates what's being done at the state and local levels. If that money were taken and sent back to places like Michigan and Detroit, I believe the states and the local communities could do a better job of meeting the needs of students than this federal bureaucracy does. It's not, it's not that old of a bureaucracy.
Talk that way, it's as if they have no memory of what life was like for instance, disabled students before the federal government got involved in education. IDEA has changed fundamentally the way we deal with students who have disabilities. So you get rid of the Department of Education. Who enforces that? How do you make sure that kids are not locked in closets? The Justice Department is also backing off civil rights enforcement. I mean, these are absurd ideas. We do need a federal Department of Education to set standards. The amount of research that drives decisions at the state level that comes out of the Department of Education, all of that research is funded in that department, and it's what we know about how our schools are doing. You wouldn't have that if you didn't have the Department. That's not the point. What she needs to do is, I think she's got a lot to prove to people in public schools and public school advocates that she's not against her. Certainly her career here has suggested that she is, and she needs to show that, look, she really is about improving outcomes.
What do you think
and quality.
We tend to judge these federal bureaucracies based on what we expect them to do or hope they do, rather than what they're actually doing. They haven't moved the needle, spending $70 billion
on disabled students.
She's got to return more control back to the states. Let parents and these local school boards make decisions on behalf of their students, and
they make them
and refocus. The mission of education at the local level.
All right, we got 1 minute left for the state budget.
That's about.
Should I just ball it up and go? We don't even have time to talk about this. All right.
It's a lot like this.
You like to throw paper now. That's the third week in a row that you've thrown
paper. But it's the first time I actually did it on camera. One thing I have to applaud is the rainy day fund could go over $1 billion. It'll be interesting to see what rainy day we're going to have to pull that back out. More money for infrastructure.
Now.
You think it's raining now? $49 million for Flint.
The liberals think it's always raining.
Well,
more money through
K through 12. If you live in Flint, it's raining pretty hard.
And
if
Flint
you drive in the roads, it's
more money for K
hard.
through 12. More money for higher ed too is one thing I saw as well. Anything that you stood out to you?
I mean, I actually think this is a pretty decent budget.
You got 12 seconds.
Prioritizes some things that I think he will have a tough time selling in the legislature, though, and that's really the test.
All right, we'll see how it all shakes out. It's always good to see you guys. All right, while President Trump's travel ban is in the courts, families are still in limbo. We wanted to keep you posted on the story of M. Bakur Mohi Eldim. He's a student at Eastern University with a green card. His mom is still in Iraq. She's been trying to come home. She lives in Detroit as well. She has a green card, and she is just weeks away from being sworn in as an American citizen. But since the executive order, she has not been able to get back to Michigan from visiting relatives in Iraq. We will keep watching their story for you. That's going to do it for My Week. Let us know what you think, or if you have any ideas for stories you'd like us to cover. Find us. We're on Twitter. We're on Facebook at MiWeek. I'm Christy McDonald. For all of us at Detroit Public TV, we'll see you next time. Take care.
Did you know Gordon Food Service was started by a 23-year-old entrepreneur as a butter and egg delivery business more than a century ago? In 1948, school teacher Gerard Wendell Hayworth borrowed $10,000 from his parents to start a woodworking operation in his family's garage. It's now Hayworth Incorporated. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.
I